Abdaljawad Omar is a lecturer in the Department of Arabic Language and Literature at Birzeit University. He's written some indispensable articles on the assumptions that people have about Palestine and Palestinian resistance, on the internal tensions in the Palestinian diaspora, the complicity of the United States with Israel's genocide, and the ongoing exterminationist attitudes that Western elites have toward Palestinian society. Ajay Parasram has roots in South Asia, the Caribbean, and the settler cities of Halifax, Ottawa, and Vancouver. He's an associate professor in the departments of International Development Studies, History, and Political Science at Dalhousie University. His research interests focus on the politics of colonialism and structural forms of violence founded and exacerbated by and through imperialism. In this conversation, we talk about how the October 7th, 2023 attack by a Hamas-led coalition of Palestinian resistance fighters sought to, quote, decompose or deform the reality of oppression that people in Gaza had been living under for a very long time, and especially the state of siege that Palestinians there had been suffering since 2006. This conversation will likely sound one-sided to anyone who believes the self-justifying fictions of the Israeli state, not only because the three of us believe that Israel's brutal domination of Palestine is unjustifiable, but because the question of Palestine has been strategically simplified into a winner-take-all binary or reduced to it's complicated, where you're forced to pick a side or back away. You know, however, on some level, that Western elites are creating a situation in which siding with Israel is the only acceptable position. But that facade is cracking. So instead of capitulating to the unthinking racist reductionism of that position, we aim to take an actual critical step back to see the settler colonization of indigenous Palestinians in historical perspective and grasp the current state of political subjectivity and discourse within Gaza and the West Bank from a place of empathy and solidarity. The only questions for the three of us are how do we name and frame the obviously genocidal acts of the Zionist state? How is Palestine grappling with the decision to rupture the relegation of Gaza to slow death and the West Bank to subjugation? What did that decision to release a flood of resistance expose about the law and sovereignty and the acquiescence of certain parts of the left to censorship and quietism? And what will come after the flood, after the rebirth of the movement to liberate Palestine and restore human rights to Palestinians?
We are at a point, as you've written, where the Israeli military is focused on causing maximum damage, right? This is from an official spokesperson. You write that life appears as this is from a forthcoming article, life appears as but a fleeting illusion of respite from drowning, a mere gasp, a single breath before drowning in the dark vastness of the sea, a breath taken only for one to be dragged back into the unknown. This is the way you describe the current state of uninhabitability in Gaza, where it's a challenge even to give meaning to what's happening, to put it into words. There's limits to what we can try and capture, and yet you and many others are in this difficult position of still pushing as the world attempts seemingly to still try and shift away from Palestine toward what you've described in this forthcoming article as normalization. And I kind of wanted to start, obviously with giving you an opportunity to just give listeners, a picture of the state of what's happening, the state of domination, I'll call it, in Gaza, and maybe you can speak to the West Bank. But this problem of having to struggle against something that is described geopolitically as normalization, right? Normalizing relations between sovereign countries, but is also a more broader cultural normalization that is deadly for Palestinians. I wondered if we could maybe start there.
I mean, if we broach this whole idea of normalization, specifically in the region, specifically tied to Israel's relationship to the region and to the Palestinians. What was meant with it is that Arabs and Palestinians would have to accept as a fact the creation of the Israeli state as a Jewish supremacist state that has basically ethnically cleansed the Palestinians, took their land, and maintains them in this perpetual state of exclusion, where they cannot even exercise their minimal rights or minimal political forms of collective imagination, including, for instance, two states or any other form of solution that was proposed historically. So the idea here is that normalization to a lot of Palestinians is almost a surrender, an acceptance of a reality that should not be accepted. And this is why it appears quite a lot in Palestinian discourse as something that is to be fought against. It's negated, to attempt to untangle it and disentangle it. What I think also the piece kind of touches upon is this, the repetition and the pulsion of the massacres that have been happening in Gaza for the past, year or so, which have also become normalized as a daily event that nobody really broaches in any significant way. It's still not really creating as much, ethical, if you want, or moral condemnation as it should. States are not really changing their policies. They remain steadfast in supporting Israel with weapons and diplomatic cover and whatever possible means that they have. And despite the rise of the Palestine movement, the politicization of new generations, this remains, the state of affairs in much of the global north, if you want. So, in many ways, normalization is a normalization of a regime of terror and horror and surrender, and even now today is it's genocide. So I think that when this word appears in our lives, it's always a fearful or let's say scary word that we tend to dislike. But at the same time, we tend to also kind of internalize in a way. And here I'm reminded by Walid Daqqa, who was a Palestinian prisoner and who was also who died in prison, and his body remains in captivity, and Israel refuses to release his body to his family so he can get buried and has a funeral. And Walid Daqqa is one of these, one of the most important Palestinian writers in the past 20 years, and intellectuals, and also a literary figure. And he speaks about um, this idea about how when we lose our ability to be angry at an event, to be angry at what's going on, to be emotionally in tuned to the suffering of people, when we lose that ability to actually think with and think through these moments morally, ethically, politically, um, that is the moment that we stop being human. And for him, this is something that he also rejected, and this is another level of normalization that we also at least should be aware of, that we shouldn't let seep in this inability to empathize and to relate to an ongoing genocide as what's occurring in Gaza at this current moment. Yeah.
It's like the normalization piece is happening. It's being enforced militantly by the state, even in terms of small gestures such as the Ontario legislature banning the wearing of keffiyehs. And well, Quebec is a whole other issue, not worth getting into the details of that. But at that kind of like level of the legislature, but then also even in our educational institutions, where it may not take the form of a keffiyeh ban, but it takes the form of various universities contracting Israeli public relations firms to try to talk about anti-Semitism, but never anti-Palestinian racism, and to actually try to frame student protests as threats to the university rather than really kind of helping universities realize the actual point of having scholarly debate and spaces to advocate for human rights, which is a huge part, particularly in social science and the humanities. But it's been, I guess, my point, building off of what we were discussing about with normalization, is to say ordinary people um, are not being subdued by this, and people en masse in the so-called global north are for Palestine. But it's the elite right now that controls our legislature, that controls our institutions, are desperately trying to present the about face that then materializes in terms of our foreign policy decisions internationally. And it's very frustrating for activists and scholars and folks who are trying to advocate for material change to not be able to, for example, successfully block the blockade, the ports, like in the East Coast and the West Coast. There's been smaller actions that have tried to do this, but people stepping up to try to stop through labor actions, our ongoing complicity with the genocide is being met with this very powerful attempt to tell us everything's fine, that this is in fact not happening, and that actually our reasoning is somehow wrong, which I think is very offensive on the one hand, but it's also not working. And I think that governments and leaders of institutions like universities are really grappling with the fact that the doublespeak and the attempts to normalize this is not working, particularly on the younger generation.
Right. And I mean, you've written recently, Abdaljawad, about how the US election of Donald Trump also reinforces the fact that it's not working, that the kind of propaganda machine that sees any form of armed struggle, of militant struggle against oppression as, untouchably taboo, as controversial, almost as abject, um, that, you know, that doesn't seem to hold against this kind of hope for liberation, at least from this current siege and this current genocide. I wondered if you wanted to talk about why you found something almost redemptive in witnessing, and I'm quoting the article, Liberal Guilt and Palestine, almost redemptive in witnessing Donald Trump's ascent to the American presidency. Um, what was it about seeing the Democratic Party struggle to not name Palestinian solidarity as one of the causes of their defeat that felt a little bit enjoyable from your perspective?
Well, yeah, I mean it's a perverse form of enjoyment, not to celebrate Trump or so people don't
Sure.
get me wrong.
No.
There's different facets to it, but I'll build up on what AJ was saying, because I think one of the and it ties to my piece. It's one of the elements that tie to Palestine as a struggle is its universal echo, no, and its ability to actually create sites of implosion that have uh, little to do with Palestine directly, but at the same time have much to do with Palestine in many ways. And this is what I think is quite fundamental, which is the way in which Palestine kind of reveals the identity nature of the ruling classes in the so-called global north. No, it quite clearly creates these moments where there's a moral indistinction between liberals and conservatives and right wing and left wing in organized politics, whether it's in Canada or in America or other places. And I think that's one of the powers, and we see it also in terms of ICC taking up the genocide case and the Americans threatening to invade the Netherlands. You see these sites of this explosion that happens in Palestine, leading to these forms of hypocritical stances, inability to really convince, defying common sense of people who are witnessing what they're witnessing on their mobile phones, and getting
Mhm.
politicized through this process, but at the same time seeing their leaders and their um, who their leaders who should be signaling some sort of moral direction, being completely hypocritical and incapable of meeting the demands of the moment, standing against the liberation of occupied and colonized people like the Palestinians.
Mhm.
So you see that all happening and bursting all of a sudden on the scene, and I think that that's a radical potential that Palestine has beyond itself, and that's why Palestine is not really a Palestinian cause in the very narrow context of Palestinian chauvinism or nationalism, but has these resonance across various sites, and that also relates to the elections in the U.S. in many ways. And for us, and I mean, I think that one of the interpretations that we should take up, on when we speak of the democratic defeat, is that why would you be energized around a party that built its campaign around joy, but was not actually hearing the voices of much of its base that was calling for a change of policy?
Mhm.
And I think that for many Americans looking at this, and for many specifically Americans who are tied to the Democratic Party one way or another, they understood that if they're not going to change or direction or signal a change of direction in the policy on Palestine, they'll still back a genocide. Why would they change policies on healthcare or on any other issue that actually Americans care about in their direct, immediate, economic needs? So there's this kind of element of Palestine refracting back on other issues that actually concern Americans in many ways, whether it's inflation or economic destitution or all of these other forms. And I think this is a moment of moral clarity, and a moment where a lot of the Democratic base also was demobilized. But going back to this whole idea of Trump coming to power, I think my perverse enjoyment of him becoming American president has two sides to it. First is seeing the Democrats being defeated after a year of backing genocide, which doesn't mean that Trump is much better on that front. They're equally bad. But that also says much that the Democrats were not able to maintain the moral high ground on any front. But also the other point, which I think for me was central, was that for a long time here in the region, and specifically in Palestine, we had a lot of these journalists and American policymakers and diplomats, coming to the region, being all arrogant and cocky, accusing our leaders of being corrupt and, charlatans and obscene and all of these things. And it's always nice, at least on some level of, childish revenge, to see them now dance to the tune of Trump, who's now obscene as well and a charlatan and corrupt and all about his self-interest. So there's that level of it, but that shouldn't be the center of our political conversation. Let's put it that way.
It's a part of it, and
Yeah.
I get it, right? Like just and witnessing what you describe as a state of collective denial, also had its joys, at least to the extent that more importantly, right? Like the politics of it, as you say, is that in attributing their defeat to Gaza, these liberals, perhaps unintentionally, concede, even if only for a fleeting moment, that Palestine wields a destructive force powerful enough to unsettle their carefully structured worldview, right? There's this kind of rupture represented by, the reality breaking through, the reality Israel does not want breaking through. Um, uh, Ajay, did you want to follow up at all?
I mean, just to say that, if elected democracy is to mean anything at all, there needs to be consequences for terrible policy decisions. And I think that what American voters demonstrated, and particularly Arab American voters in those particular key states, is that it matters, and that, like Abdaljawad was saying, you can't just think that you can go around funding supporting genocide for a whole year and then try to claim the discourse of joy. There's no joy in that, and I think people saw through that in all those same ways. So in as much as we can look to elections for any kind of real leadership, which I don't know that we can, it is comforting, as you put it. There's a childish level of joy that I too feel when the liberals have to basically eat their own hats because of, I mean, honestly, let's call it the stupidity of their policy choices. It's an arrogance that and that gives rise to a sense of entitlement amongst liberals in whatever country they seem to be, certainly between Canada and the United States, which is why everybody hates them, regardless of what position that you end up taking. At least the conservatives or the right wingers are a little bit more transparent about what they think, but the indistinguishability in terms of their actual policy actions is, I think, the point that's really important. But at one level, there's got to be some punishment if elections mean anything.
I mean, that's one of the elements of like liberals flocking after the elections and criticizing, the Palestine movement for this, failure. And it's a weird position to take because, on the one hand, most of the democratic strategists would say Palestine didn't play a role, or they would confine it to like Michigan and Dearborn and these heavily Arab or districts that have heavy Arab voters. So why would you blame Palestine if it's a very small narrow issue? Because at some level, if you want to admit that Palestine was actually the reason behind your failure on an electrical policy, you need to change policy. But what is important is that Democrats will never change policy in Israel because this is a policy that is so entrenched in imperial, buildup. There's a lot of psychic, ideological, and political investments in sustaining and this entity called Israel in its Jewish supremacist form. That it would be very difficult to actually have any change in direction of policy. And what's fearful at this moment, and this is where we can go back to our beginning in the conversation, is that we will see only, the ruling classes in Canada or the U.S. criminalizing Palestinian activism, trying and attempting to choking the movement from by creating new laws and outlawing the kufiyya or whatever form of criminalization that could work, because that's the only way to actually stop people when they have already become aware, when the ideological blinders have been revealed, and is to start criminalizing this new awareness that came with Tufan al-Aqsa and what happened as a result. So that's the strategy now. It's to move towards criminalization.
Yeah, I mean, the what you were saying there kind of got me thinking about the ways in which, um, you know, and you've written extensively about this. Israel has crafted an image of its own invincibility, and how that is kind of instrumental in terms of the ability to narrate onto the region this false image of stability that does not exist. That Israel, supported by the United States military machine, will impose a level of order on a region that is beset by disorder. And in fact, Netanyahu recently claimed credit for what's happening in Syria, correlating it with recent Israeli airstrikes. So, I mean, we're in a place, I think, where Israel's strategy of shock and awe is not only impacting the psyches of Israelis, reinforcing their feeling of invulnerability, but I think it's also kind of marketing that notion that Israel is invincible to the West more broadly. Did you want to speak to like how that's a kind of carefully crafted strategy, and this notion of a cognitive strategy that is favored, as you say, by Israeli military leaders? What's going on in terms of the information campaign and the strategy of shock and awe?
Look, I mean, it's a complicated topic to broach, but I will say three things. First of all, I mean, as we're well aware, when it comes to any form of colonialism, but specifically this form of settler colonialism that Israel has, practiced since its inception, military power is fundamental to its ability to both constitute itself and expand and maintain its attractiveness for new settlers from the world. No, like so, this has been a fundamental precipice of Zionist ideology since the inception, which is that military force should be used creatively, innovatively, and it should be used to make the Palestinians and the Arabs in the region submit not only to the presence of Israel, but also submit to it politically and maintain this kind of asymmetry with Israel in the region as a whole. And this is where I think, Scott, we can quite disagree with your earlier framing, which is, the framing of Israel imposing order on a region that has a lot of disorder. I think it's the opposite: is that Israel creates a lot of disorder in the region, supports it, feeds on the fragmentation of various peoples through this kind of divide and conquer policy that it practices, and it has practiced since its inception. Alongside it, of course, America and a lot of its allies in the region that have supported its presence or have accommodated themselves to its presence since its inception. So that's one element of that. But in military terms, one of the ideological, let's say, elements of attraction, specifically tied to the Jewish world, that was reeling from the Holocaust and post World War II, was the fact that Israel, this small number of Jews in the Middle East, were able to defeat, Arab armies, were able to create these moments of utter and sheer power. They were able to create this kind of model of a new Jew, which is the Hebrew, who fights and wins and is genius at crafting military operations and can shock his enemies and can overcome them. So that's one of the fundamental aspects of also Israel as an attractive destination for this form of identification that rose with it, which is that Jews are not victims anymore; that they have a place, and this place not only can protect them, but in fact can actually give them a taste of power. And this is one of the elements of this kind of charismatic pull. And a lot of the narrative around Israel's success, entrepreneurship, economy has been tied centrally to its militarism as well. So what I posited in one of my pieces was that Gaza has actually created this kind of moment where shock is decoupled from the ability to inspire awe. So in many ways, that Israel is able to be or has become this form of military power that is monstrous, that destroys Gaza, makes it into a heap of rubble, that uses massacre as a primary weapon. But on military terms, whether it's the October 7th offensive by the Palestinian resistance, where Israeli soldiers and military and the Southern Command fell like a house of cards, or subsequently with the Palestinian resistance attempting as much as possible to resist the onslaught of the military machine within Gaza, Israel was not able to really create in that war, and still isn't able to create in that war any moments of awe or inspiring, its charismatic power, and that has consequences and repercussions on it, because that's one of the elements that have actually played quite important role in opening the ideological blinders that we talked about before, in people seeing the truth of Israel through its monstrosity at this moment. It doesn't mean that Palestinians will come out victorious, not to, so nobody gets me wrong. But what it means is that we're seeing this transformation in how this military machine is used. And it ties, there's a lot we can speak about here. But yeah, some would claim that when it came to Lebanon and its fight with Hezbollah and its preparations there and its ability to use pagers and walkie-talkies and intelligence and these type of operations, Israel was able to still maintain this kind of level of creativity slash intelligence and air power and its use, to decapitate Hezbollah's leadership and hurt its systems of communication, etc., and render it defeated. On some level, they might be quite right, but I think still Israel was not really able to create these moments of an awe-inspiring military power. So, how we think about the implications, I think one of the implications that we see immediately is the change around the globe of how people across the world see Israel as a state and its legitimacy going forward. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we could just point to the way the world consumed video of the death of al-Sinwar, right? The Hamas leader, and the difference between the way the world consumed that video and how that video was shared within Israel, which your analysis suggests that there was no real attempt to control that message, in part because of the level of euphoric joy um, that Zionists felt at seeing that man killed. But that video could not have possibly inspired awe. And you say it was a mechanistic, impersonal, kind of cowardly act that couldn't have possibly inspired that level of spectacle. Um, I don't know if you had any follow-up comments or questions, Ajay.
I mean, just that, rather than convey awe, what it has done is catalyze disgust internationally. And I think
Yeah,
even people who maybe wouldn't have thought one thing or the other necessarily about Israel and Palestine are coming to the conclusion that actually, this is a celebration um, of state terror. And I think this is something,
right,
especially when we think about the last 20 years, right? And the global war, the so-called global war on terror, and the discourse and the Islamophobia, and all of this that we've been
hmm
um, seeing discursively in international politics over 20 years. People still, it has taken, I think, this particular event for people to understand that terrorism is a strategic act that can be deployed by a state as well as non-states. And I don't think that people en masse who have been viewing this, who have been seeing it on social media, and even despite mainstream media's best attempt to try to put a rosy picture on Israeli policy, there's just no one who's really buying that anymore. And I think people are really understanding that. I hope that you can't just trust the state simply by virtue of being a state to do what's in the best interest of humanity. And this is something that, for racist reasons in the West, people have cast on Africa. Like African states do bad things, but what white looking states don't do bad things like this. And I think it's one of the reasons why it's been resonating so much, particularly across indigenous movements here in the settler colony. Like, I know it's been a long time coming and lots of organizing around this, but the the framing of this as an anti-colonial struggle in Palestine of indigenous Palestinians against a settler colonial state has had really powerful resonances across various indigenous groups and movements, not just in Canada and the United States, but internationally. Um, and yeah, precisely the opposite. And I think it demonstrates the rawness of the awfulness and of the modality of settler colonialism.
yeah, and I mean, just to clarify, before maybe you take it in a different direction, I don't know. I was certainly not reinforcing the idea that Israel actually brings order to the region. I was sort of trying to undermine it in terms of, you know, uh, uh, exposing the absurdity of somebody like Netanyahu, a war criminal, saying that Israel is the blessing, whereas these other groups, these militant groups, these non-state actors are the curse, right? Like putting it in those kind of is the word Manichaean, like very binaristic, good versus evil terms. Yeah, I think we're hopefully in a more of a ideologically messy world in which it's possible to understand um, that, as you bluntly put it, like whether we like it or not, Hamas is now the primary force leading the Palestinian struggle. And beyond that, I think you put it even more pointedly that the political forces that are still holding on to and leading a resistance agenda are not the secular left. So again, it's the whether we like it or not that I maybe wanted you to speak to, right? Like, um, it's like we don't get to pick the contours of our liberation struggle, the face of it, the identity per se, and yet there is this widely accepted talking point, as you put it, that Palestinians should refrain from armed resistance in order to cultivate a favorable image in the West. So there's obviously this tension, but whether we like it or not, when George Floyd was killed, people burned down a police station. Whether we like it or not, there was property damage as an expression of collective rage in the wake of that death, that murder, by public lynching, right? So when rage happens and it gets expressed in a violent way, rather than catalyze disgust, we're seeing now a shift away from that into a different register, whether we like it or not. And I wondered if you wanted to kind of expand on that element of it.
I mean, interestingly, even with the I don't know, assassination of the CEO in New York, we're seeing also quite a reaction that approaches healthcare policy in the United States instead of like looking at the act of murder itself, no, or just condemning the assassinator in this context. And I think what it says, I mean, I'm not saying here, I don't want to go into like this whole debate on moral rightfulness of violence, but I think in the colonial condition, violence is the norm, and it has we live under a regime of terror in Palestine, whether in the West Bank or in Gaza. Take different facets. It's a regime of violence. We live under people like Netanyahu who see the world through these kind of Minchian zero-sum game. It's either us or them, and they're the ones that control policy. They're the ones that control the world. And before October 7th, I'll remind your viewers is that there was no real, Palestine movement around, or Palestine even being, a center of discussions or awareness or consciousness. It doesn't mean there was no infrastructure or people weren't talking about it, and connections and alliances were being made, whether with the indigenous people struggling in Canada or in other places. But also there was this kind of slow erosion of Palestine as an issue. And I think one of the facets, whatever happens, I mean, in this war on ongoing genocide, one of the facets that we can certainly say is that this whole idea of we should cultivate a favorable image in the West has fell. It doesn't seem that violence in of itself creates the conditions for people to not actually start listening, to raise their own level of awareness around what's happening for 100 or so years in Palestine, create movements, become politicized, sometimes even become more radicalized. I think that that's all been the process since October 7th. So those people who in Palestine were claiming that, I think their argument simply, at least in this sense, fell since October 7th. There hasn't been a better moment for the Palestinian cause and its spread across the world, except this moment that we're in today. So whatever happens in terms of the ground, the battle, other debates around why armed resistance is not useful, there's a lot of arguments around it. But at least this argument, I don't think it has any credibility anymore.
That is fascinating, and I have lots of questions about that. But always jump in, Ajay, if you have anything to add. Feel free to interrupt. But you just reminded me that this article that's coming out provides a comparison, both sort of semantic and empirical, between the intifadas between 1987 and 2006, which you call spontaneous eruptions of the damned, collective actions that the Palestinian masses ignited through a mix of disruptive acts employing a wide array of tactics and based on an affective burst or overflow. And you say that those bursts of subversive rhythm, not prompted by a decision, are fundamentally different from October 7th and the Al-Aqsa flood. which was the culmination, you say, of the work of a confined guerrilla movement. Um, did you want to sort of pick apart at all this concept of intifada, which you provide even sort of the etymology of and kind of a theorizing of in relationship to the non-sovereign decision of October 7th?
Yeah, one of the facets of the October 7th moment was that it was actually a deliberate surprise attack by a established guerrilla movement, no, that has prepared
Right.
itself to create the surprise and was successful. It defeated the Israeli intelligence, and again, it defeated the Israeli Southern Command. So on
Mhm.
a merely military level, that's what it was able to achieve, at least in the first couple of days. But one of the important elements is that in the past, when the center of the struggle for Palestine moved from, in the 60s and 70s, it was based in the Palestinian diaspora, specifically in the countries surrounding Palestine, and it moved into Palestine itself. The primary means of, or the primarily big events that Palestinians have been able to create in terms of revolutionary rhythms, what was called the Intifada, which means shaking off. But these intifadas, or the first and the second, were in fact not totally embodied in the decision of a movement or one character. Actually, it's a funny thing. A lot of conferences that look towards the intifada, you will have people from different political parties arguing who started the intifada, which already tells us that nobody started it. And some will claim, some people on the left will say we're the ones that prepared the ground, we're the ones that did it, and somebody from the Islamists will say, but nobody really prepared the ground for it. Usually it was a collective burst, and that collective burst, its advantage was that nobody was responsible as well. That's the important element of it, is that because we're all revolting at the same moment, the organized movement's role would be to organize the revolt and create these subversive rhythms and direct the struggle. But nobody can really take complete authorship over this moment of revolt itself, which means that they also cannot take complete responsibility for its repercussions. No?
Mm.
And one of the elements in the internal Palestinian discourse today, because October 7th was the decision of a person and a small group of people, is that they're now being held accountable for the decision and whether it's actually strategically effective, whether it's not. That's one of the pitfalls of this moment of the non-sovereign decision. I call it non-sovereign because the idea is that here it's a decision of deforming the existing order, not to actually sustain the order. Usually, sovereign decisions relate to the way you actually, whether it's Giorgio Agamben or others who theorize this, is that the sovereign's right to, declare the exception. In this context, this is a decision to actually deform what existed before, to challenge the existing order, the colonial regime of forms that existed, for instance, around Gaza, including the Gaza envelope and the military bases around it. So that was the character of the decision, and the character of the decision is to also lead the Palestinian struggle from a moment of being eroding, frozen, unalive, to this kind of animated position, but also to the unknown, because one of the facets of the tufan, even as a word in Arabic, is that it doesn't really necessarily mean, for instance, liberation. Tufan is a flood, and the flood, sweeps away a lot of things, sweeps away a lot of illusions, tests the veracity of people's claims, movements' claims. Will Iran actually really fight? Will Hezbollah continue to support Palestine or withdraw? Will the leftist in the global north be truly leftist and radical and actually heed the call of Palestine? Will people get this is a moment where when we say when Tufan erupts, it demands from people this kind of alignment between word and action. It's calling on them to meet the demands of this moment and to ensure that they're in sync with the character of this decision. And I think this is one of the facets of this moment, that it comes from an organized movement, a guerrilla army, that was established in the Gaza Strip as a result of the two intifadas. But unlike the intifadas, it's not a spontaneous decision of people. It does not overflow from this kind of collective, spontaneous electricity and muscles of people coming down to the street because of, an emotional rupture, but one that is deliberate, rational at some level, but also takes us to this position of being in this domain or space of the unknown.
And attempts to, I think, break what you call this perpetual cycle of conquest and entrapment that Israel finds itself perpetually in as it seeks perpetual war. And you seem to suggest that, from within the Israeli psyche, like that's a perfectly comfortable state. But because of that bizarre comfort in a certain asymmetrical military dominance, um, you clearly are predicting um, that the forces opposed to Israel will deny it a quote frictionless victory, right? So I think like that's part of the idea here is that there's moments of rupture that expose the everyday violence of colonialism, but then there are these more sort of like organized forms of solidarity that seem to hold the capacity to contain the uncontainable force that is this like hyper resourced 21st century military that has now tools of artificial intelligence and so on that are accelerating its ability to do damage.
Just as we're talking here, I'm reminded of Somdeep Sen's book, Decolonizing Palestine, where he talks about the kind of the double duty that Hamas in particular needed to. Obviously, he wrote it before October the 7th, 2023, but the dual role of being simultaneously a post-colonial government in structure and waiting and an anti-colonial force that has to do the necessary tasks of driving resistance at the same time. And I think that the way, like, the particularities of expectations around states and what is not states in the international discourse, at least, is oftentimes like it's not clear that the international community, where it rests on treating Gaza as a state or as a not state. And that ambiguity, I think, allows a lot of sloppiness in terms of how people engage what's happening and the resistance to it. So, as in terms of thinking about the distinction between what happened in 2023 and then the intifadas that precede it, and yet we're connected to creating the space for it, I think that's a really useful framing, Abdaljawad.
This idea of the post-colonial and the colonial and the anti-colonial all mix. I mean, this is one of the problems with, if you guys noticed, trying to ascribe to Israel's regime any form of word. It's that it's settler colonial, it's a military occupation, it's apartheid, it's genocide. So there's all of this kind of hyper uses of words to attempt to describe the system, because I think at some level Israel kind of embodies a lot of facets, takes a lot of the experience of everybody else and its histories of colonialism and what Europe did to the rest of the world for 500 years, and kind of condenses them in this one small place and space and articulates this kind of hybrid form of system. But it's true that there are elements of post-colonial malaise that Palestinians suffer from, which is we have some form of flag independence. Palestinians in Gaza could, at least at some level in their daily life, forget that there's an occupation. So they move within this walled prison, but within their daily rhythms, their family life, their intimate lives, the type of economic activities they engage in, although the occupation and Israel's presence is looming and structural and provisions a lot of elements of their life and determines them and delineates it. But on the level of the everyday, Israel is absent. And I think that's one of the elements that is so disorienting for Palestinians. fighting a settler colonial machine, while at the same time having that settler colonial machine being present and powerful, but also absent at the same time. And that this creates a lot of dissonance. And I think for a movement like Hamas, which was responsible for the governance in Gaza, but was also working and still building the infrastructure of resistance, this choice between accommodation with Israel, prolonging its governance structure, or moving towards this paradigm of turning what we can call turning the tables, and just going for it in this moment of strategic offensive against Israel, was at some level a choice, but at the same level it's also a necessity. Meaning that I think one of the problems with people assessing October 7th, specifically from a Palestinian context, is that they quite exaggerate Israel's response as a way to assess whether October 7th was the right decision or not, when they should ask themselves whether this war was a necessary war. Whether this, so this is an element that we should think before we think politically and strategically and what happened and the repercussions and all of these things. The first point is that people should take notice of whether this was a necessary war from the position of those in Palestine. And I think for those in Hamas who took the decision, it's clear that this decision was a decision to undo and unmake the world that was at least before October 7th. And this is why, Scott, I call it a moment of deforming, because we don't know what happens, because it could actually lead to Israel returning to the strip and building illegal settlements, or to ethnic cleansing, or it doesn't mean that it will actually produce a moment of liberation or decolonization. But what it could mean is that, what the essence of the decision is that we're not going to exist in the same domain as we existed before. That something has to change. Even if it goes to the worst, we'll take that wager. And that's what really unfolded since then. And I think this is how we should look at this decision and how it was made. And there's a lot of people that will write assessments long after this decision because of its importance and centrality and the nature of it as a world, perhaps historic event that will have repercussions on the world as at large. Hamas was the one that took it, solving this dilemma between governance and resistance and going all out for resistance.
Yeah, I mean, as you put it, and I know I'm quoting your work a lot, but like I feel as though you're writing very, frankly and powerfully about states of being that people like myself could scarcely imagine, right? Like there's a sentence where you're describing Al Sinwar's childhood, and you say, in these streets and alleyways, resistance is born and takes shape not as a choice, but as a necessity etched into the lives of those for whom defiance is the only path to dignity. Yeah, I think understanding that more deeply is really important. Just generally speaking, but with a particularity when it comes to the Palestinian diaspora. The next question I had was around the particularity of the West Bank, the politics of fear in the West Bank, and how it produces a certain quietism, I guess, or inability to actually take radical action.
Yeah, I mean, the West Bank is, if Gaza and Hamas and the resistance movements, which is not Hamas, because Hamas is not the only resistance movement in Gaza, took the fight to Israel, and there's a lot of historical reasons why resistance was concentrated and consolidated in the Gaza Strip and not in the West Bank, for instance, including the fact that after the Second Intifada, Israel withdrew from the Gaza Strip and took up the small infrastructure of settlements that had around 11,000 settlers in what it called then the disengagement plan, but was actually a retreat, the first retreat of a settler colony in the history of the struggle with Zionism in Palestine. And Hamas took over the strip and started building this project of resistance. In the West Bank, the other thing happened, which is that resistance movements in the Second Intifada were defeated. They were either assassinated or killed or neutralized. And a new regime, a neoliberal economic regime, rose from the ashes of the Second Intifada, led by a comprador Palestinian class that will become the ruling classes, and whose politics is basically based on cooperation with Israel. So that's the lay of the politics in the West Bank, is that the leadership, the ruling classes, the major capitalist class is all about cooperation, accommodation, not really going for this paradigm of resistance, and ensuring that Israel can have a frictionless form of colonialism, so that there's no real resistance to it. And of course, I think October 7th didn't change that paradigm. That's one truth that we can take, is that it didn't actually, push this leadership to take a different position in relation to attempting to synchronize the struggle with Gaza, which is a missed opportunity, because if Israel had to deal with both Gaza and the West Bank at the same time, there's better chances of success for the Palestinian liberation movement than only Gaza by itself. That's one element. But the other element is not only is embodied in the lack of decision by people like Mahmoud Abbas, who lead the Palestinian Authority, is the fact that there's no real organized forces that are outside of this political system or economic system that pervades the West Bank. The reason for it is myriad, but one of the elements that have to do with it is the severe repression and corrosion that exists, including Israeli daily raids in Palestinian towns and arrest campaigns and assassination of key activists and their neutralization. It includes the consumerist economy that has been built, and the new subjectivities that have practiced political amnesia in Palestine. Again, going to this paradigm of an existing occupation that you can forget and try as much as possible to live your life without remembering the looming threat that will come and kill you at any point. But you can put it or disavow it or place it somewhere outside of the frame of reference of your daily life. And with every attempt to actually organize politics, people are arrested, killed, etc. So the problem in the West Bank is that you don't have the ability of the only organized force is counterinsurgent, and the rest of society, which wants or desires at least liberation, is incapable of producing an effective organized movement to meet the demands of the moment and to call, or let's say to meet the demands of the flood as well that happened since October 7th. This is coupled, of course, with fear, with what's happening in Gaza might happen to us, and these are paralyzing emotions, because it's like a ship being hit by the winds from every direction, but remains in a moment of stasis. It cannot move. It cannot really shift. It desires liberation, yet cannot produce an organized movement. It has fear that genocide will also, or ethnic cleansing will happen in the West Bank. So all of these emotions are mixed, and that's why when Palestinians in the West Bank are now raising the question of what is to be done, they generally reach the conclusion that there's nothing much that can be done. That's how, at least, the lay of the ground is in the West Bank.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds petrifying. I mean, proximity to Israel right now, given the, as you said, messianic settler movement that is currently in power, it's got to be absolutely petrifying. We talked a fair bit last time we spoke for the podcast about the politics of the West Bank, but you weren't with us at that point. Ajay, I wondered if you had any questions at all about the, the kind of conditions of political subjectivity in the West Bank, and how that fear of a colonial power combined with the underdevelopment and this induced economic collapse makes it difficult to form any sort of resistance.
Well, yeah, just listening to your description there, Abdaljawad, kind of it sounds like, from like a kind of tactical perspective, thinking about Israel kind of in the middle of that, you know, abusing one side extra hard in order to coerce complicity from the other. It's just, it seems like such a state of torture, you know, a ship in the sea getting bashed by winds in all directions and thus staying in place. Um, just wonder about the diversity of views within the West Bank. You know, like there must still what are the kinds of debates? I would like to believe that there's a little bit more ability to have conversation in public spaces, perhaps. But maybe I'm completely wrong about that. Like, what's the level of political discourse like in the West Bank? Obviously, we know what's happening in Gaza in that regard, but is there an ability to kind of get at some of these important political and intellectual distinctions at the moment?
Well, the bad news is no, not really.
Yeah.
The good news is, I mean, look, I mean, the problem with intellectual debates, first of all, like Palestinians have a very anti-intellectual sensibility to them as well, because they think that the intellectual has to be one that actually is on the forefront of the struggle. So intellectuals that are only discussing things are, seen with a bad light, including myself. But the thing about um, the current level of discussion, I think, is that it's quite hung up on October 7th as a decision. And the reason for it is quite numerous. I think there's a highly psychic response to what has been happening rather than an intellectual, deliberative, if you want, rational discourses around it. All of that exists as well. On one level, I mean, October 7th was this kind of moment that actually opened the horizon of possibilities, including turning this idea of liberation from one that is uh, hanging around somewhere in the imaginary to some sort of ability to actually translate it into an actuality. And the real sense of closeness or proximity to liberation, uh, in fact, induces a lot of anxiety as well. So there's that level to it. Why does it induce anxiety? Because I think you've lived so long under an existing order that you've been formed by it in many ways. It has become part of who you are. Imagine Palestinians, for instance, now broken into 5 geographies, including, Palestinians in 48 who have citizenship in Israel, Jerusalem, the West Bank, and Gaza, and Palestinians in the diaspora. And they've built sometimes identities around these geographies, and sometimes they even, look at themselves as part of one group, and they question perhaps even if there's one body of collective called Palestine or Palestinians. So there are choices being made within an existing order, including like, financial choices, but including also choices of who to marry and who not. There's the girl that left her fiance because he went to prison and he's going to spend his life in prison. So people are also in a constant state of becoming in this condition, and they have made choices. Some of their choices are not proud of, but they're also part of the choices that this system actually present them with, or this existing order presents them with. And I think October 7th on some level also induced uh, this kind of anxiety of liberation. I'm not saying that people are against liberation, but it reminded them, okay, this is possible because look, this is what happened to the Israeli army. That Israel is not as invulnerable as we thought it is, and that's one level to it. Is that that moment created this kind of elation at the success, fear of what might come next, but what will happen if we actually get liberated? We'll be able to like pull this off. How will we see ourselves and our world and our questions in a post occupation or colonial society that lives in a different domain altogether. And I think that was the radical potential that actually October 7th provisioned, but at the same time, it's one that left people quite utterly, I think, shocked from their own internal conversations with themselves. This is one level of it. But the second level of it is that since that moment happened, you know, in Palestine, this is a system that kind of tests individuals, but also collectives. You know, it tests you if you're a coward or if you're courageous, if you're willing to die for the cause and become a martyr, if you're not willing to do that, if you're going to curse the resistance or be with the resistance. No, it's always placing you under these kind of like, if you want Nietzschean, you know, tests of, are you going to actually overcome these systems? Are you going to be able to overcome yourself and, you know, and assert your own personality or your own subjectivity in a specific way? And to be honest, I mean, within colonialism, a lot of people, you know, fail in these tests. You know? Like they don't, you know, they don't make it. They're incapable of, you know, they find that they're actually cowardly, or they find that they're actually um, not as strong as they thought. That they, if they go to prison, that they're going to confess on their friends and their comrades. You know, people actually figure out that they're not as tough as they think, or they're not as, and that creates also a lot of shattering experience and traumatic experiences along the way. And I think for a lot of Palestinians looking at October 7th, this was a moment that was uh, uh, highly testing of the character, the consistency of thinking that you might have, and whether you're able to actually meet the demands of the moment. And by looking at this moment and viewing it, a lot of people disavowed it. A lot of people criticized it. A lot of people, you know, beyond the psychic assaults and ideological assaults that are happening through the media and, you know, counterinsurgency and psychological operations that the Israel and the media that, you know, has been bombarding Palestinians with, questioning the efficacy of resistance, trying to ascribe the responsibility for the genocide on the shoulders of the resistance. You know, all of these type of things. But with a lot of that happening at the same time, I think, you know, when you're already defeated, but somebody gives you a potential for success, are you going to respond with becoming more alive, or are you going to still insist on defeat, for instance? So there's, you know, melancholic forms of subjectivities actually think that, okay, maybe I was drenched too much in this love for defeat, that, or my love for defeat, and now there's this moment that actually breaks through this paradigm of permanent defeat or eternalized defeat, and maybe I should question myself, or should I criticize those who took the decision to show me that there's a real potential for liberation. So a lot of the discourse, unfortunately, is stuck in that moment, even though since a year or so, we've moved away from that moment. I mean, a lot has been happening, whether in, you know, the context of Israel's war in Lebanon, or whether in the context of the conditions of resistance in Gaza, or whether in the context of what's happening on the global front, or, you know, whatever it is that is happening. There's a lot of things happening and events happening, but people are still stuck discussing whether Sinwar and his military command should have taken this decision or not.
You know, as always, like a perspective that like it's not possible to gain. I don't think like this is incredibly important in terms of like giving more of a full picture to what you described earlier in the conversation, is this kind of universal echo that the Palestinian struggle, generally speaking, for freedom represents globally, and you wish clearly could represent for Palestinians in all of their kind of disparate geographies, right? And you just listed them. You clearly kind of yearn for that forming of a unity around rejecting Israel's violent transgressions. But the question for me is still like, will like is Israel capable of regaining the capacity for shame. It is clearly being shamed, but you've talked about how there is this kind of process through which one loses that feeling of shame and becomes unmoved by massacre. And it does feel like that's the sort of that's one tipping point. The other is the one that you kind of, I guess, more hopefully outlined, which is that there was a moment where, Gaza broke out of prison, as Mariam Barghouti put it, right? Um, and that, that was a refusal to accept slow death. That was a refusal to accept this kind of, administration of slow death. The truth of it is, the future will see more struggle. It will see more instability and violence in the region, and it's hard to imagine another way forward. Um, as Israel now encroaches upon Syria, entering Syria, it's now waging a war on multiple fronts. This is it feels like a new reality that we're entering, and it's deeply frightening. When I talked to Michael Hart about the prison break in Gaza, this is what he did. He sort of compared it to the struggles of the 1970s, the decolonial struggles of the 70s, and how, yes, there were movements that had internal flaws, a degree of cowardice, to use that term, and those groups failed. But the groups that were overwhelmed by a superior force, you have to define that more as a defeat than anything resulting from an internal flaw. Maybe the thing I'll do is just to say, I think the kind of theorizing you're doing and the sort of intellectual output that you've got is, first of all, like mind-blowingly prolific. Like, you're producing a lot, and it's incredibly, analytical and rigorous and all this stuff. So that, to me, in the context that you're writing, is like a heroic act. I'm just really blown away by the recent writing, but just want to thank you, obviously, for making the time again to talk to us.
Thank you, Scott.
Yeah.
And thank you, AJ. I'm happy to be with you both, and to hear also from AJ about what is unfolding in Canada, and because sometimes we have this question whether really there's a resonance over what's happening here and unfolding. We can't keep up with the news, and to me, I'm always happy to hear that there are still people that are working and thinking and getting animated over the Palestinian struggle and being radicalized by it, and also at the same time politicized by it. So thank you guys for having me, and much love for both of you.
Thank you so much. And, just in parting, I just wanted to stress, it's en masse. I really want to stress that part, that it's people, ordinary people en masse around here that are so moved every week, every day, every time, every conversation that we are having. People's hearts and their minds are in Palestine. And I remember even at the beginning, one student came to me in tears after a class, and they just said, "What am I even studying international law for? What is the purpose of studying international law if we can't intervene to stop something like this?" So, it's such a pleasure to be able to share space with you, to think alongside you. Thank you, Scott, for bringing us together. And yeah, I mean, I just wanted to reiterate the fact that it is large numbers, even if it doesn't get immediately reflected in our foreign policy.
Thanks, AJ.